Good afternoon. I'd like to pay my respects to the Sami people of Norway and the President of the Parliament, President Ollie, for his welcome this morning, and my congratulations to Les and Vicky for their election as co-chairs. The Pacific preparatory meeting for the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples was held in Redfern, Sydney, Australia, on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on the 19th, 20th and 21st of March this year. The report is in a number of parts. Each of 18 themes were addressed. Each theme was introduced by a delegate. There are about 80 delegates at the meeting, and then there was a discussion around the delegations, around the introduction of these themes, and they're summarised in the report. The start of the report contains a declaration. I won't read it all out, but it was an assertion that the assertion of sovereignty by colonial powers over Indigenous peoples, their territories, lands, seas and resources were based on morally reprehensible theories that have no basis in fact or in law. These theories are manifested in strategies designed to destroy Indigenous peoples and nations, including through the dispossession of Indigenous peoples' lands and territories, the destruction of Indigenous peoples' political and legal institutions, the discriminatory practices of colonising forces aiming to destroy Indigenous peoples' cultures, the failure to honour treaties with Indigenous nations, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes and the militarisation of Indigenous peoples and their lands, and the corporatisation and commodification of Indigenous peoples and their worlds, and the implementation or the imposition of development models that are making life on Earth uninhabitable, of which the impacts of climate change could prove to be the most destructive. And we asserted, in respect to the first theme about the World Conference, that Indigenous peoples of the Pacific be respected, promoted and fulfilled, and that those recommendations outlined in our report be considered at the Global Indigenous Peoples Conference here in Alta. In respect to the theme of review of involvement of Indigenous peoples in the UN system, there are lots of recommendations under each theme. I'll just point out a couple of key ones. We said that the Human Rights Council should implement special measures to ensure that Indigenous peoples with expertise in Indigenous peoples' rights are appointed to all treaty bodies such as Human Rights Committee. It also emphasised that such appointments will provide UN treaty bodies with greater understanding of Indigenous peoples' rights and how those rights impact upon monitoring of conventions and treaties. In respect to the first and second decades of the world's Indigenous peoples, we said that if there was to be a third decade, we would recommend that a UN High Commissioner on the rights of Indigenous people be established to offer the best expertise and support to the different human rights monitoring mechanisms in the UN system in relation to Indigenous peoples. With respect to the organisation of WCIP 14, we made a decision about the essential criteria we would use in authorising delegations to the meeting next year. We made quite a lot of recommendations with respect to health. The most key one, I think, is that states should adopt a clear and concrete and long-term national plan of action to achieve Indigenous health equality. With respect to justice, we said that the states must develop processes to ensure that both provisional and national laws, policies and procedures comply with international standards, including human rights treaties and the Declaration. We considered violence against women, but my sister from Hawaii will deal with that. This is a tag team effort here today. In relation to self-determination, we said that states must be accountable for the implementation of the Declaration, and that states must fully respect the right to self-determination, and that the UN should remind states that when they're making decisions or exercising power or authority at the subnational level, including governmental bodies, such bodies must comply with the state's obligations concerning the protection and promotion of Indigenous peoples' rights. In respect to lands and territories, again, the emphasis by the Sydney meeting was that we promote and enable self-determination for Indigenous peoples through the development of constructive agreements. Regarding education, this will finish off my bit, co-chairs, and then I'll hand over to Malia. There are a lot of recommendations endorsed at the meeting about education, and the first one we endorsed was that in line with the United Nations Declaration of Rights on Human Rights and Article 14 of the Declaration, we would strongly urge the UN General Assembly to adopt the right to education as one of the priority themes for the discussions at WC 14. Thank you.
Aloha kako. My name is Malia Nobriga Oliveira, and I'm from Hawaii. And I'm continuing the Pacific report from Sydney. The thematic areas that I'm going to cover first is violence against women. And one of the recommendations, and what Mick did, I'll just highlight some of our key recommendations in the report, that states acknowledge publicly in discourse across policy, programs, and through education that as a result of the violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples through the process of colonization and acculturation, that this violence itself has been internalized in Indigenous family systems and has become a disease to which we have been forcibly afflicted. It must now be viewed as a familial and community disease to be treated holistically in partnership with Indigenous peoples themselves and in accordance with the principles of the Declaration, in particular Article 3 on self-determination. There was also recommendations around the increase of funding for community-led violence prevention initiatives, as well as culturally appropriate crisis and counseling services in Indigenous languages. Climate change is a matter of life and death. Some of our key recommendations is to ensure the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples, and that states would consider a mechanism through which they can monitor and report on the impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples, mindful of our socio-economic limitations and spiritual attachment to lands and waters. And that the UN General Assembly recommends that the UNFCCC upholds the right to participation in decision-making and free, prior, and informed consent on any decisions adopted at the Conference of the Parties. And one of the things we highlighted here is to include Indigenous and traditional knowledge for future technical workshops. We also talked about Indigenous involvement in all aspects of climate change law and policy, such as development, implementation, monitoring, assessment, and review. And also under climate change, we talked about and made recommendations around having a broad human rights perspective, and that Pacific Islanders have a right to remain in their motherland and maintain culture and traditions. Under the thematic area of militarization, one of our recommendations is that the UN and its relevant institutions and agencies should investigate gross violations of human rights perpetrated in the Pacific region, in recent decades by military forces with a view of providing redress for the victims of those violations and bringing the perpetrators to justice. There was also a recommendation referring to the need for demilitarization of the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples. Our next thematic area is regarding decolonization. And we had recommendations that referred to the recognition of the forceful removal of Indigenous peoples from their islands in the Pacific, and that the UN urged governments to apologize and to make repatriations and compensation to the descendants of those affected, and to support them to locate their families, places of origin, and restore their identity. There is also a recommendation that came forth from the Pacific meeting supporting the ongoing call by Indigenous peoples of the Pacific for states to be placed back on the list for decolonization. Our next thematic area is that of equality and non-discrimination. And a key recommendation here that came out of our meeting is that all states in the Pacific fully comply with their responsibilities under the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Our next thematic area is that of oceans, that which connects all of us in the Pacific, becoming one of the largest regions. Some of our key recommendations here is the recognition by the UN of the inherent and spiritual and cultural relationships of Indigenous peoples with their oceans and the flora, fauna, and natural resources therein. We also recommend that states recognize the dual and devastating threat of climate change and unsustainable harvesting practices on the ocean's fisheries, and the subsequent urgent imperative to take active measures to protect that natural resource. And we also looked at the UN urging the compliance by states and corporate entities with environmentally responsible harvesting methods and standards. Also under this thematic area of oceans, we looked at the UN urging states and companies to fully respect the principles and the spirit of international agreements in relation to Indigenous peoples' rights, resources, and territories, and that all activities that exploit resources from the Pacific Ocean requires environmental, social, and cultural impact assessments to ensure that there is free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples, owners of the lands, territories, and resources. And we welcome you to review the rest of our document for our additional recommendations. Mahalo.
Thank you.